welcome back to Drowsy History. If this is your first time here, welcome. You found a quiet place to land at the end of a long day, and I'm glad you're here. Before we begin tonight, take a slow breath and let yourself settle. Adjust your pillow. Let the day go. There's nothing you need to hold on to right now, and nothing that can't wait until morning. Just you and a long, slow story about one of the most beautiful and demanding lives a woman could have lived in any era of human history. Before we ease in, do me a small favor. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. It helps the channel reach more people who need exactly this kind of quiet at the end of the day. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's one of my very favorite things about making this channel, picturing all these different places, all these different windows and bedrooms and late nights, all connected by the same slow voice. Tonight, we are going to Japan, feudal Japan to be precise, a Japan of cherry blossoms and sword-polished steel, of tatami floors and paper walls, of an entire civilization built on the interlocking obligations of loyalty and honor and hierarchy so elaborate that even getting dressed in the morning was a form of philosophy. We know the samurai. We have always known the samurai, the warrior, the swordsman, the embodiment of bushido, the way of the warrior. His image has traveled across centuries and cultures and become one of the most recognizable human archetypes on the planet. We know considerably less about the woman who shared his house. She is the quiet figure at the edge of the frame. She poured the tea, she raised the children, she waited. That is the simplified version, and like all simplified versions, it is not wrong exactly, but it leaves out almost everything that matters. The extraordinary education, the specific and demanding code of conduct, the genuine authority she exercised within her domain, the weapons she kept hidden beneath her robes, the grief she was expected to transform into composure, the life that was simultaneously constrained and remarkably substantial. Tonight we sit with her. We live her days and her seasons and her silences. We understand, as fully as history allows us to, what it really meant to be a samurai wife. Close your eyes whenever you're ready. Let's go to Japan. You did not choose to be born into a samurai family. No one chose the circumstances of their birth in feudal Japan, and even if they could have chosen, the concept would have been difficult to explain to anyone in that world, where the family into which you arrived determined everything about the shape of your life before you drew your first breath. Your father is a samurai. This is not simply a profession, the way a man might be a carpenter or a merchant. It is a hereditary status, a legal category, a set of obligations and privileges that define the family's place in a social order as precisely arranged as a formal garden. The samurai class, the bushi, sits above the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants in the Confucian hierarchy that structures Japanese society during the Edo period, that long stretch of relative peace and stability that runs from 1603 to 1868. Above the samurai are only the court nobility and, in theory, the emperor. In practice, it is the shogun who holds actual power, and beneath him, the regional lords, the daimyo, and beneath them, the samurai who serve them. You have been aware of your position in this arrangement from the earliest age at which awareness is possible. You learned it from the way the servants addressed your father, from the way your mother carried herself in public, from the specific bow required when greeting someone of higher station, and the specific bow owed to you from someone of lower. You learned it from your clothing, which is silk where a merchant's daughter wears cotton, and from the two swords your father wears at his belt, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, which are not accessories, but marks of caste, as distinct and significant as any heraldic symbol. You are probably 5 or 6 years old, the first time you formally begin to understand that your life will have a specific shape, and that shape is not entirely of your choosing. Girls in samurai families begin their education early, earlier in many ways than their counterparts in other social classes, because there is more to learn and less tolerance for ignorance. The wife of a samurai must be a woman of genuine accomplishment, because she represents not only herself but her family, and after marriage, her husband's household and her husband's lord. So you study. You study the Chinese classics because a cultivated woman reads and writes with facility. You study calligraphy, which in Japanese culture is not merely penmanship, but an art form, a practice through which character is revealed and refined. You study ikebana, the art of flower arrangement, which is not decoration, but a practice rooted in Buddhist aesthetics, in the understanding that beauty has a season and impermanence is to be acknowledged rather than denied. You study the tea ceremony, cha no yu, which is also not simply a beverage preparation, but a complete philosophy made practical, a practice of mindfulness and harmony, and the deliberate cultivation of the present moment that can take a lifetime to master and never quite is. You study music, the koto, the 13-stringed zither, whose sound is one of the defining sounds of Japanese aesthetic culture, its notes lingering in the air with the specific quality of something that is already in the process of ending, even as it begins. You study poetry, and not passively. You are expected to compose, to be able to produce a waka or a haiku in response to a natural observation or an emotional moment with the ease that later generations might produce a text message. The ability to compose a poem at the appropriate moment, in the appropriate form, was a social skill as essential as conversation. You study household management, which encompasses far more than it sounds. The management of a samurai household is a substantial administrative task. You learn to manage servants, to oversee the accounts, to ensure that the household stores are adequate and its finances in order, to understand the protocol for receiving guests of various ranks, to arrange the household for formal occasions, to manage the obligations of ceremony and gift giving that structure samurai social life. You are being educated, in other words, not merely to be decorative, but to be functional in a very specific and demanding role. And beneath all of this, threaded through every lesson like a second curriculum running alongside the first, you are learning something harder to name, the specific form of composure that your position requires, the management of emotion as a practice, the understanding that your inner life is yours, but your outer presentation belongs to the household and to the social order that household serves. You are learning, in the language of the era, mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, and the equanimity that comes from sitting with that awareness rather than struggling against it. You are also, somewhere in the corner of a room, learning to use the naginata, The naginata is a pole weapon with a curved blade, somewhere between a spear and a sword in its function, and it is the traditional weapon of samurai women. The lesson begins early, before your body is fully grown, and it continues throughout your life. You are not learning this as a hobby or a formality. You are learning this because the obligation to defend your household in your husband's absence is real, and the expectation that you will be capable of it is genuine. The naginata is for defense of the home, of the children, of your own honor in circumstances where honor requires defense, and its presence in your education is a reminder that the samurai wife's life, for all its cultivation and ceremony, exists in a world where violence is always a possibility. You also learn to use the kaiken, the small dagger that samurai women carry concealed in their robes. The kaiken is for a specific and final purpose. If capture or dishonor becomes inevitable, the kaiken provides a way out. You learn this young. You understand it young. It is simply part of the world you inhabit, another aspect of the code that governs everything, and you receive this knowledge the same way you receive everything else, with composure, with the understanding that knowing how to die with honor is part of knowing how to live with honor. This is the world into which you are born. It is demanding and beautiful and specific, and within its demands and its beauty, you are being prepared for the specific role that awaits you. You will be someone's wife. The question is whose? The specific curriculum of a samurai girl's education deserves more attention because it reveals something important about the world's actual expectations of her. The emphasis on writing is not incidental. Japan in the Edo period had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and within the samurai class, literacy for women was essentially universal, not a luxury or an exception. You read, you write. You are expected to compose poetry with sufficient fluency to respond appropriately in social situations where a poetic response is the correct one. This is a demanding standard, the equivalent of expecting someone today to produce a well crafted formal essay at a moment's notice in a room full of people evaluating the result. The Confucian texts that form part of your education present a philosophy of social harmony that depends on everyone fulfilling the role appropriate to their position. Filial piety, respect for parents and ancestors, is the foundation of this philosophy, and from it extends the network of relationships, ruler and subject, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend. The samurai wife who has absorbed this philosophy genuinely, not as external constraint, but as a framework that shapes how she understands the world, occupies her position very differently from the samurai wife who experiences it only as obligation. The aim of the education is the former. The martial component of the education is worth dwelling on because it is the element most likely to surprise modern audiences who picture samurai women primarily through the lens of the decorative. The naginata is not a beginner's weapon. Its proper use requires core strength, coordination, footwork, and a specific kind of tactical thinking about distance and timing that is distinct from the thinking required by a sword. Training begins with the basics of stance and movement and develops over years into something approaching fluency. A trained naginata practitioner is formidable against opponents who have not trained against the weapon's range advantage, and the training is taken seriously precisely because its purpose is serious. The specific style of naginata training that samurai women practiced also included techniques for fighting in the confined spaces of a house or corridor where the weapon's length can be a disadvantage as easily as an advantage. This is not hypothetical training, but practical preparation for the specific defensive scenario, the household threatened from within or without, while the husband is absent, that the training is designed to address. The woman who completes this training over years is not decorative. She is dangerous, and the household that contains her is harder to threaten than the household that does not. The first thing to understand about your marriage is that you are not the one who arranges it. This is not a surprise. You have known from childhood that your marriage will be a matter of family negotiation, of alliances and considerations that extend far beyond your personal feelings about the man involved. In the samurai world, marriage is politics at the household level, and the household's needs and honor and strategic interests take clear precedence over the preferences of the individuals being married. The process begins with your family engaging a go between, a nakodo, who navigates the initial conversations between the two families. The nakodo is a skilled social operator, someone familiar with the networks of the samurai class, able to assess compatibility of rank and reputation and family standing, able to communicate interest without commitment and probe for reciprocal interest without causing offense if the initial approach is declined. This person carries the weight of the negotiation with a delicacy that reflects how high the stakes are. A badly managed approach, a clumsy negotiation, can cause real social damage to both families. You will likely participate in a formal meeting, a maiai, at which you and the prospective husband see each other for the first time under arranged circumstances, surrounded by family members and the go between with a ritual pretense of casualness that fools no one. You pour tea, he observes. You observe. Very little of genuine substance is communicated in these moments, and the people doing the observing are primarily the family members rather than the young people involved. What they are assessing is presentation, bearing, health, temperament as far as can be read in a formal setting, and the general impression of whether this person seems likely to be a credit to the household they are entering. You have almost no formal say in the outcome. In practice, a family that cares about its daughter's well being will take her impressions into account, and a prospective husband who strikes her as genuinely repugnant might be declined on grounds that preserve everyone's face. But the range of acceptable outcomes is set by the families, not by you, and what you bring to the marriage is understood by everyone, including you, to be less your individual self than your family name, your training, your health, your childbearing potential, and your capacity to manage the household you are entering. This might read, from a modern distance, as cold. In its own context, it is not cold so much as organized according to completely different values. The concept of romantic love as the basis for marriage is not absent from Japanese culture. Literature and poetry are full of it, and the ache of longing and the sweetness of attachment are documented with extraordinary sensitivity in the writings of samurai era Japan. But romantic love is understood to be a separate thing from marriage, or at best something that might develop within marriage over time, not something that is expected to precede it or that provides its foundation. The foundation is obligation, mutual interest, appropriate rank. Everything else is what life builds on top of that. Your dowry is prepared carefully by your family, a substantial collection of household goods, clothing, and furnishings that will be yours within the new household. The dowry is a statement of your family's regard for you and their investment in your new life, and its quality reflects on the family as much as on you. The trousseau includes your kimono, of which you will have many, each appropriate for a specific season and occasion, each a small work of art representing significant expense. It includes household items, lacquerware, writing implements, the equipment for the tea ceremony. It includes your naginata. The wedding ceremony itself is a Shinto ritual conducted with the exchange of sake cups in the Sansan Kudo, 3 times 3 sips, that binds you and your husband across the shared cup. There is ceremony and formality, the exchange of formal robes, the presence of family members on both sides conducting themselves with appropriate gravity. The wedding is not a celebration of the two individuals so much as a formal merger of two households, conducted with the dignity that such a transaction requires. And then you move. You leave your father's house and go to your husband's. You leave behind the rooms where you grew up, the household rhythms you have known all your life, your mother's particular way of managing things, your sisters, the servants who have known you since childhood. You arrive in a household that is organized according to different rhythms, with different hierarchies, different customs, different expectations. Your mother in law, if she is living, is now the senior woman of the household, and your relationship with her is among the most important you will navigate. She is the authority on how this household works, and learning to operate within her authority while gradually establishing your own sphere of competence is a delicate process that can make your first years in the marriage either tolerable or very difficult. You may be 15, you may be 17. The age of marriage for samurai women during the Edo period varies by family and circumstance, but it is generally young by any modern standard. You are crossing from one world into another, and the world you are crossing into will be your world for the rest of your life. What you bring to it is everything your education has prepared you for: the composure, the skills, the knowledge of protocol and management, the aesthetic sensibility, the quiet competence across a wide range of domestic and social arts. What you are developing, beginning from the first day in the new household, is something that cannot be taught. The specific knowledge of this family, this husband, this life. The social networks that structure samurai women's lives are functional, not merely decorative. The wives of samurai who serve the same lord form a community with real internal hierarchy and real mutual obligations. The wife of a senior retainer holds social authority over the wives of junior retainers in ways that parallel the structure of the men's world and the management of these relationships, maintaining appropriate deference upward, extending appropriate consideration downward, navigating the inevitable frictions of a structured community with grace, is a significant portion of a samurai wife's social competence. Formal gift giving occasions structure the social calendar and require careful attention. The gifts that pass between families at New Year, at the births of children, at deaths and significant transitions are calibrated communications of relationship and standing. Too small a gift is an insult, Too large is presumptuous. The correct gift requires knowledge of the recipient's taste and position and the nature of the relationship being maintained. Managing the household's gift giving obligations is part of the administration that falls entirely to you. The formal visits and the hosting of visitors are yours to manage as well. When important guests come to the household, the preparation, the arrangement of the room, the selection of the scroll and flower arrangement appropriate to the visitor's rank, the menu, the behavior of the servants, the greeting, is under your direction. The impression the household makes on visitors is substantially your creation, and that impression matters in ways that directly affect your husband's standing and the household's position within its community. The samurai household is organized around principles that Western domestic architecture does not share, and understanding the space you now inhabit is understanding something essential about the life you are living. The house is built from wood with paper screen walls, the shoji, that slide rather than hinge, dividing and reuniting the interior spaces with a flexibility that Western solid wall construction cannot achieve. The floors are covered in tatami mats, woven from rice straw and rush grass, their dimensions standardized across Japan so that the size of a room is measured in mats, a 6-mat room, an 8-mat room. The tatami is not merely a floor covering, it is a surface that determines behavior. You remove your shoes at the entrance, always, because the tatami is clean and must remain so. You sit on the tatami, kneel on the tatami, sleep on the tatami on a futon that is folded away each morning to preserve the mat and the space. The relationship between the body and the floor in Japanese domestic life is intimate and specific, and managing it well, sitting in the correct posture for the correct length of time, moving gracefully between the various postures required by different situations, is a physical skill that you have been practicing since childhood. The tokonoma is the alcove in the main room where a hanging scroll and a flower arrangement display the aesthetic sensibility of the household and the season. The tokonoma is a focal point, a statement of cultivation, and its arrangement is your responsibility. What scroll is appropriate for autumn? What flower arrangement speaks to the mood of a formal occasion? What communicates grief without naming it, or celebration without excess? The tokonoma is where you practice mono no aware made visible, where you put into form what cannot always be put into words. The kitchen is your domain in a very specific way. The cooking and management of food in a samurai household is governed by principles that combine the practical and the philosophical in the way that everything in this world combines the practical and the philosophical. The diet is primarily rice, fish, vegetables, soup, a diet of great simplicity, and when prepared with skill, great refinement. The preparation of food is not merely nourishment, but a practice of care, a form of attention to the well being of the household that flows through every meal. You oversee the kitchen, even if servants do much of the actual cooking. The decisions about what is served, how it is prepared, how it is presented belong to you. The garden, too, is your concern. The Japanese garden is not a garden in the Western sense of a place where plants grow. It is a composition, a miniature landscape that evokes a larger one, governed by aesthetic principles that have been developed and refined over centuries. The arrangement of stones, the pruning of trees and shrubs into forms that suggest their wild counterparts without mimicking them, the placement of water features, the management of light and shadow through selective planting. These are arts in their own right, and the garden of a samurai household reflects the taste and cultivation of the household's women as much as its men. The household has servants. How many depends on the family's rank and resources, which vary considerably across the samurai class. Not all samurai are wealthy lords. Many are relatively modest retainers whose households are comfortable but not grand. At the upper end of the samurai class, a substantial household with many servants requires a great deal of management. At the lower end, the household may be smaller and the mistress's direct participation in the domestic work more extensive. In either case, the management of the servants, their assignments, their performance, the maintenance of appropriate relationships between them and the family is your responsibility. The physical demands of managing a Japanese household in this era are not trivial. The floors must be swept and the tatami cleaned. The sliding screens must be maintained. Paper screens require periodic repapering as they become damaged, and the wooden frames need attention. The futon must be aired. The lacquerware must be cleaned with the specific care its surfaces require. The clothing must be maintained. Kimono are complex garments that require specific storage, specific care when soiled, the services of specialists for cleaning and repair. The management of all this, across the seasons, within the household's budget, is the work of a capable administrator. The seasons are not incidental to this management. Japanese aesthetic culture is organized around the seasons to a degree that shapes daily life at every level. What is cooked, what is served, what flowers are arranged, what scroll hangs in the tokonoma, what kimono is worn, what poetry is considered appropriate. All of this changes with the seasons in ways that you are expected to know instinctively and execute without error. Getting the seasonal references wrong, wearing a fabric pattern associated with summer and autumn, arranging flowers inappropriate to the month, is not merely an aesthetic failure. It is a failure of cultivation, and in the samurai world, cultivation is a form of character. The household is quiet in ways that Western households of the era are not. The shoji walls absorb and distribute sound differently than solid walls. Conversations in adjacent rooms are audible but indistinct. Presences known without details. Privacy maintained through the understanding that what is heard through paper walls is not registered. The garden beyond the house provides the sounds of water and wind and birds that become the texture of the days. The sounds of the city or the countryside beyond the garden's walls are the background against which the household's internal quiet is maintained. This is the space in which your life takes place. Within it, you are not a passive figure. You are the manager, the arbiter of taste and atmosphere, the person through whose decisions the household's character is expressed. Your husband's world is the world of service to his lord, the world of training and strategy, and the constant readiness that his position requires. Your world is the house, and within it, you have genuine authority. The management of the household budget is a dimension of your authority that deserves its own attention. The samurai household operates within the stipend provided by the lord, a fixed annual payment in rice that must cover all the household's needs. Within this fixed income, you manage expenditure with the same skill you bring to every other aspect of household administration. The accounts must balance. the household's obligations, to servants, to tradespeople, to the various ritual occasions requiring expenditure, to the ongoing maintenance of the physical space and the family's appearance, must be met within the available resources. This is not always easy. The samurai stipend system produced significant variation in household wealth across the samurai class, and not all samurai families were prosperous. A low ranking retainer's household operates on a tight budget that requires genuine management skill to keep functional. The samurai wife who makes the stipend stretch, who maintains the household's appearance of appropriate cultivation without exceeding what the budget permits, who absorbs unexpected expenses without disrupting the household's equilibrium. She is demonstrating a practical competence as demanding as any of the arts that receive more official recognition. The seasonal preparation and storage of food is another dimension of this practical knowledge. Rice must be stored properly through the year. Tsukemono, pickled vegetables, are prepared in quantity during appropriate seasons and stored for use throughout the year. Preserved fish and other proteins are managed with awareness of how long they will keep and how they should be rotated through the household's supplies. This is knowledge with real consequences for the household's health, and it is yours to maintain. Your husband is a samurai, which means he belongs to his lord before he belongs to you. This is not a metaphor. The system of obligation that structures samurai life places loyalty to the lord, the daimyo, above all other personal relationships, including marriage. Your husband's primary duty, the one around which all others are organized, is his service to his lord, and everything about your life together is shaped by this fact. What does this mean in practice? It means first that he is often absent. The nature of samurai service during the Edo period, after the great wars have ended and the peace that the Tokugawa shogunate enforces has settled over Japan, varies considerably from the combat obligations that defined earlier eras. Your husband may serve in an administrative capacity at his lord's castle, which requires regular attendance and may mean extended periods away from home. He may be required to participate in the Sanken Kotai system, the alternate attendance system by which the Tokugawa shogunate requires the daimyo to spend alternating periods in their home domain and in Edo, the shogunal capital. This means the daimyo travels, and the samurai who serve the daimyo may travel with him, leaving wives and families behind in the domain while the men attend in Edo. The periods of absence can be long, months in some cases. The management of the household during these absences falls entirely to you, and this is not a diminished role, but in some ways a more demanding one. You make the decisions that would normally be made jointly or by the household head. You manage the accounts, the servants, the children's education, the household's social obligations. You represent the household in whatever social interactions arise during your husband's absence. You handle whatever difficulties emerge: illness, disputes with neighbors, problems with the servants, without recourse to him. The preparation for his departures and the management of his returns are their own rituals. When he leaves for an extended period of service, there is a ceremony of departure, formality maintained even in grief, the farewells conducted with composure, even when the emotions underneath are substantial. You watch him go. You do not weep in his presence, because weeping in this context is a burden placed on the departing person and therefore a kind of selfishness. You weep later if you weep in private. When your husband is present, the household arranges itself around his needs and his schedule with a precision that reflects his central importance. His training must be accommodated. The samurai who neglects his martial arts in peacetime is failing in his duties, and the sounds of practice with the bakken, the wooden practice sword, or the hours spent in meditation, or the time devoted to calligraphy and other cultural accomplishments, are all part of his proper routine. Your management of the household ensures that his life proceeds without the kinds of domestic friction that would distract him from these obligations. Your relationship with your husband is formal in public in ways that intimacy does not require privacy to express. Open displays of affection between spouses are not part of samurai culture. The love that may exist between you is expressed through service and attention and the management of his world rather than through words or touch in view of others. In private, the relationship may be entirely different. The literature of the era makes clear that tenderness and genuine connection between husbands and wives was real and common. It was simply not the public face of the relationship. The question of concubines is one that the historical record requires honesty about. Concubinage was an accepted institution among samurai of sufficient means during this period. A man might have a primary wife, which is you, occupying the formal position of principal consort, and one or more concubines who occupied a legally and socially distinct position. The children of concubines could, in some circumstances, be recognized as legitimate heirs if the wife produced none of her own. Managing this reality, if it pertains to your household, requires a specific form of composure, the acceptance of something that is simultaneously hurtful and socially sanctioned, navigated with the dignity that your position demands. The death of your husband changes everything. Widowhood in the samurai class during the Edo period has a specific shape. You may shave your head as a mark of renunciation and grief and enter a kind of informal religious life, not necessarily the full ordination of a Buddhist nun, but an adoption of the aesthetic and the practice of renunciation that signals your withdrawal from the social world associated with your role as wife. You may continue to manage the household, particularly if your children are young. You may return to your birth family if the circumstances of your husband's death and the needs of your husband's household permit. What you do not do, in most circumstances, is remarry quickly or easily. Second marriages for samurai widows exist, but they are not the norm, and the social expectations around widowhood are shaped by the same values of loyalty and dedication that governed the marriage. Your husband is gone. Your primary social identity was defined by your relationship to him and his household. Navigating what comes next, within the constraints of those expectations, is one of the more complex transitions in a life that is full of complex transitions. The question of emotional intimacy within samurai marriage is one that the official record tends to leave underdeveloped because the official record is concerned with duties and obligations rather than feelings. The reality, visible in the poetry and the letters that samurai couples exchange during periods of separation, is more emotionally various than the formal record suggests. The convention of Chinese and Japanese love poetry provides a vocabulary for expressing feeling that the direct statement cannot. When a samurai wife writes a poem about the sound of rain on an autumn evening without her husband, the formal structure of the poem holds the feeling at a slight remove that is itself a form of expression. The restraint is the message, the discipline of form demonstrating the discipline of emotion. The feeling is there. The form acknowledges the feeling while managing it, which is precisely what the code requires and what the poetry tradition enables. The letters that passed between separated couples, preserved in some cases by descendants who recognized their value, show a tenderness that the formal public relationship does not advertise. Small details noted: the quality of the light in Edo, the particular food at the castle town, the behavior of a specific retainer that would amuse the absent spouse. These details are love letters in a different vocabulary than the Western tradition developed, but they are love letters nonetheless. The samurai wife, who manages her household competently in her husband's absence, is doing something that has both practical and emotional dimensions. On the practical level, she is ensuring the household's continued function. On the emotional level, she is demonstrating through action the commitment that the formal relationship requires, but that the heart also means. The management of the household in his absence is a form of faithfulness to him, to the household, to the obligations they share, and he knows it. The returning husband who finds the household in order, the accounts balanced, the children progressing, the servants functioning, he is receiving something that the poetry cannot fully say. The tensions that exist within samurai marriages are also part of the record, though recorded differently. The seven grounds for divorce loom over the marriage as possibilities, and a wife who produces no sons lives with that specific anxiety in ways that color everything else. The presence of concubines in households where they exist creates a complexity of feeling that the code requires the wife to manage with composure but does not eliminate. The loneliness of extended absence is real and documented. The friction between a wife and her mother in law can make a household feel like contested territory rather than shared ground. These difficulties are not failures of the system. They are the human content of the system, the reality that exists inside any social arrangement, the evidence that the people living within the code are fully human and therefore fully subject to the whole range of what being human includes. The samurai wife who maintains composure through these difficulties is not the suppression of feeling, but its discipline, the management of what is felt in service of what is owed, which is also, in this world, a form of love. The production of heirs is not an ancillary function of your marriage. It is, in the social logic of the samurai world, the primary one. The household requires continuity. The lord requires loyal retainers, and loyal retainers must be produced by families with the capacity to reproduce themselves. A woman who bears healthy sons for a samurai household has fulfilled the central obligation of her position, and the entire weight of this expectation is present from the earliest days of marriage. Pregnancy in this world is managed through a set of practices and beliefs that combine genuine folk medicine with spiritual protection and aesthetic attention. The pregnant woman observes certain dietary restrictions, visits certain shrines, wears the hara obi, the pregnancy sash that supports the abdomen, from the 5th month. Childbirth is attended by women, midwives, female relatives, servants with experience. The birth of a son is celebrated with a different quality of relief and satisfaction than the birth of a daughter, though daughters are not unwelcome. They too have roles to play in the household's social strategies as future wives in marriages that will seal alliances with other families. The early care of infants is primarily your responsibility, though wet nurses are employed in households of sufficient means, allowing you to nurse your children yourself or to delegate this to a specialist. Either way, the management of infants in this world is conducted without the specific equipment that modern parents consider essential: no cribs, no strollers, no high chairs. The infant sleeps on the futon beside its mother or is carried against her body in the wrapping cloth, the obi repurposed to hold the child against the back while the mother's hands remain free for work. This closeness is not merely practical, but reflects a philosophy of child rearing, in which the infant is kept in constant contact with the primary caregiver, its needs met immediately, its world defined by warmth and proximity. The education of your children is your responsibility until the boys are old enough to begin their formal samurai training. You teach them the cultural foundations, the poetry, the calligraphy, the Buddhist concepts that underlie so much of the era's aesthetics, the manners and protocols appropriate to their rank. You instill in them the values that their father's world requires: loyalty, courage, the specific relationship with honor that the samurai code demands. You tell them stories, and the stories are not merely entertainment, they are instruction. The tales of loyal retainers and noble deaths and the proper management of grief and fear are the curriculum through which you transmit the values of your world into the next generation. The daughters require the same education you received, and you are their primary teacher for much of it: the calligraphy, the music, the tea ceremony, the principles of household management, the martial arts. You oversee their learning, you correct their practice, you are the standard against which their own developing competence is measured. Being the model for your daughters is its own form of discipline. You cannot allow your own practice to lapse without undermining theirs. When your sons reach the appropriate age, typically around 5 or 6, their formal samurai education begins under male instruction, and you release them to it. This is a transition that the literature of the era marks as significant. The child who has been entirely in your world moves into a world that has different rules and different values, and that will ultimately take him away from you in a more fundamental sense, into his own service and his own household. The preparation for this release and the grace with which it is accomplished is another dimension of the composure that the samurai wife's life demands. Children die in this era at rates that are very difficult to contemplate from a modern distance. Infant mortality, childhood illness, the various diseases for which the era has limited treatment, the loss of children is a grief that most mothers in the samurai world experience. The response to this loss in the samurai framework follows the same principles that govern the response to all loss: composure in public, the management of grief as a private matter, the continuation of function in the face of what the heart holds. You light incense at the household altar. You recite the sutras. You tend the relationship with the spirit of the lost child through the practices that Buddhism provides. And you continue. The household altar, the Butsudan, is one of your central responsibilities. The ancestors of the household require tending, offerings of food and water and incense, the recitation of prayers, the marking of death anniversaries, the ceremonies that maintain the relationship between the living household and the dead family members whose spirits are understood to remain part of it. The Butsudan is where the dead are present, and managing that presence with the appropriate ritual attention is a significant part of your spiritual life and your daily practice. You are raising children not for yourself, but for the clan, for the Lord, for the continuation of a household whose needs extend beyond any individual members. This understanding does not make the love less real. The diaries and letters that survive from samurai women of the Edo period are full of genuine maternal tenderness, of worry about sick children, and pride in their accomplishments, and the particular grief of watching them leave. The love is real. The framework within which it operates is simply organized around different priorities than modern parenthood, and the samurai mother contains both things simultaneously without perceiving them as contradictions. The specific practices of pregnancy and childbirth in the samurai world reveal how completely the domestic sphere is organized around the household's needs rather than the individual's comfort. The hara obi, the long cloth that wraps the pregnant abdomen from the fifth month, is worn for warmth and support and for spiritual protection. The ceremonies around its adoption, marked by specific prayers and rituals that invoke the protection of Inari, the fox deity associated with fertility and household prosperity. The pregnant woman is not excused from her duties during the pregnancy. She continues to manage the household, to maintain her practice of the arts, to fulfill her social obligations. The postpartum period has its own customs and its own difficulties. The confinement period, in which the new mother is expected to rest and recover while the household's other women take on additional responsibilities, is genuine provision for recovery, a recognition that childbirth depletes the body in ways that require specific care. The practices of the period include specific foods believed to restore strength, specific rest requirements, specific restrictions on activity that reflect a sophisticated empirical understanding of what the body needs after birth, even if the theoretical framework explaining why differs from modern medicines. The education of very young children is conducted entirely within the domestic sphere by the mother and the household's women. The earliest moral education, the stories and the examples and the modeling of behavior that shape character in children before they have the capacity for formal instruction, comes from you. The values that will govern your son's relationship to his Lord, your daughter's relationship to her future household, are instilled in the years before formal education begins, in the daily interactions of the domestic sphere that you govern. The relationships between siblings in a samurai household are themselves structured by the household's values. Older children are expected to model the behavior and the values for younger ones. The hierarchy within the family is a miniature version of the hierarchy that governs the larger world, and children learn to navigate it by navigating its domestic equivalent. The eldest son's position within the household is distinct from his siblings, and the management of these relationships, ensuring that precedence is observed without creating resentment that damages the household's internal cohesion, is another dimension of the household management that falls to you. Your own relationship with your children is formally structured by the code's requirements, but experientially rich in ways the code cannot fully specify. The love is real. The pride in their accomplishments is real. The grief when they suffer or fail is real. These feelings exist inside the formal relationship, expressed through the forms available: the poem composed to mark a milestone, the careful arrangement of a celebration, the particular attention paid to a child who is struggling, rather than through the direct emotional expression that modern parenting makes central. The indirection is not coldness. It is a different grammar of care. You live by a code, though it is not the same code that governs your husband. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is his code, and it shapes the entire architecture of his life. Your code is different in its specifics, but parallel in its structure, and its name is Anabugeisha, the way of the woman warrior, or more broadly, the set of expectations encoded in texts like Ona Daigaku, the greater learning for women, which articulates in explicit terms what the ideal samurai woman is and does and believes. Ona Daigaku, attributed to the Confucian scholar Kaibara Ekiken in the late 17th century, is a text that modern readers find deeply uncomfortable, and it is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than dismissing it. The text prescribes, in clear and detailed terms, the subordination of women to men, to father before marriage, to husband during marriage, and to son in widowhood. It specifies the qualities a wife should cultivate and the failures she must guard against. It is, by any modern standard, a document of severe gender inequality, and it was genuinely influential in shaping the expectations placed on samurai women. And yet, the historical reality of samurai women's lives is considerably more nuanced than any prescriptive text fully captures. The gap between what texts say people should be and how people actually live is universal and significant, and the Edo period is no exception. Women who were educated, capable, and intelligent found ways to exercise genuine agency within the frameworks available to them, and the record of their lives, in their own diaries and letters, in the accounts of contemporaries, shows a more complex picture than the prescriptive literature provides. The 7 grounds for divorce specified in the code are one of the most discussed and distressing aspects of samurai marriage law. A husband could divorce his wife for failure to bear children, for licentiousness, for failure to serve her in laws, for excessive talking, for theft, for jealousy, and for illness. The wife had essentially no formal equivalent right. She could not simply leave. She could seek refuge at certain Buddhist temples that were designated as sanctuaries for women in intolerable marriages. These temples, called kakakomadera or enmisoji, offered temporary refuge, and in some cases could negotiate a formal dissolution of the marriage after a period of residence. But the power asymmetry is real and cannot be softened into something it is not. What the code also specifies, alongside all of its restrictions, is a set of genuine obligations placed on the husband. He is expected to provide for his wife. He is expected to conduct himself with the dignity appropriate to their shared honor. He is expected to value the management of the household she provides, to respect the skills she has spent her life developing, to understand that the domestic sphere she governs is not lesser than his public one, but parallel to it, essential to the proper functioning of the whole. The concept of uchi, the inside, the domestic sphere, and Soto, the outside, the public sphere, is fundamental to understanding samurai life and the particular dignity of your position within it. The uchi is not a diminished sphere. It is a different one with its own authority, its own demands, sabras, its own measures of excellence. The samurai wife who manages her uchi with skill and grace is not subordinate to her husband's soto so much as complementary to it. The two spheres are understood to require each other, to function together as a whole that neither could constitute alone. Your personal virtue, your character, your composure, your cultivation is understood to be a direct reflection of and contribution to the household's honor. If your behavior brings shame to the household, it damages the household's standing in ways that affect your husband's ability to function in his world. If your behavior reflects credit on the household, your skill in the tea ceremony observed at a formal gathering, your poetry circulated and admired, your management of a difficult situation with particular grace. This is a positive contribution to the household's reputation that has real social value. The concept of giri, duty, obligation, is one of the organizing principles of your life. Giri to your husband, to his household, to his lord through the chain of loyalty that connects your domestic sphere to the political one, to the ancestors through the butsudan, to your children through their upbringing. These obligations are not burdens in the way that modern individualism might read them. They are the structure that gives life its shape and meaning. To fulfill your obligations is to be the person you are meant to be. To fail them is to be something lesser. This is not coercion exactly. It is a system of values that is genuinely internalized, that has been part of the way you understand the world since before you had words for it. The capacity for self-sacrifice that the code demands is not hypothetical. Samurai wives historically demonstrated it in recorded incidents that have become part of the literature of the era. Women who protected their households in their husband's absence, women who bore the news of their husband's death with composure and then organized the household's response, women who faced their own deaths in circumstances of conflict or dishonor with the same deliberate calm that the code required of their husbands on the battlefield. The kaiken, that small blade in your robes, is the material expression of this ultimate obligation. If the household falls, if honor requires it, the knowledge of how to use it properly, directed at the jugular vein in a manner that produces a swift and dignified death, is not macabre. In the context of this world, it is the final proof of the code's hold on you, and also of your agency within it. If the worst comes, you are not helpless. You have a choice. The choice is terrible, but it is yours. The tea ceremony is not merely something you do. It is something you practice in the deepest sense of the word, a discipline that, like all genuine disciplines, is never completed, never perfected, always offering another dimension of depth to enter. And in the samurai woman's life, it is one of the primary spaces where the inner life finds its form. Cha no yu, the way of tea, was developed in its formal structure by the great tea masters of the 16th century, most significantly Sen no Rikyu, who served as tea master to the warlord Oda Nobunaga and then to Toyotomi Hideyoshi before being ordered to commit ritual suicide by Hideyoshi in 1591 for reasons that historians still debate. Rikyu codified the aesthetic principles that govern the tea ceremony. Wabi, the beauty of the imperfect and the humble. Sabi, the beauty of age and change and impermanence. And the four principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility that define the ceremony's spirit. The tea room itself embodies these principles. It is deliberately small. 4.5 mats is the classic size, and the entrance, the nijiriguchi, is a small square opening that requires every person who enters, regardless of rank, to bow and crawl through. This is not incidental. It is the ceremony's first statement. In this room, social hierarchy is suspended, and all are equal before the aesthetics of tea. The lord and the servant both crawl through the same small door. The samurai wife, who hosts the tea ceremony in her own room, performs a ritual that is simultaneously domestic and philosophical, simultaneously a social skill and a spiritual practice. The preparation of the bowl of tea is a sequence of movements that has been refined into something that approaches choreography, not in the sense of performance, but in the sense of movement that has been stripped of the unnecessary until what remains is exactly what the moment requires. The placement of the utensils, the folding of the fukusa, the warming of the bowl, the scooping of the matcha powder, the ladling of the hot water, the whisking, each action is performed with an attention to form that requires years of practice to make look natural, and the naturalness is the goal, because anything that looks practiced breaks the illusion of ease that is the ceremony's gift to the observer. You have been practicing the tea ceremony since childhood, and this long practice has given it a different quality than the formal occasions when you host it for guests. For you, the preparation of tea is also a meditation, a practice of presence, a way of entering the moment fully that the endless demands of household management do not always permit. The tea room is, in some ways, the one space in your life where the performance of composure that is required everywhere else becomes something genuine, where the composure is not managed for anyone's benefit, but simply arrived at through the practice. The aesthetic life that the tea ceremony anchors extends through everything you do. The ikebana arrangement in the tokonoma, the selection of the scroll for the season, the poetry you compose and exchange, the garden you tend, all of these are expressions of the same sensibility, the same relationship with beauty and impermanence that the tea ceremony formalizes. You live in an aesthetic universe that is total in the way that very few modern people experience, where every element of daily life is considered and where the consideration is understood to be a form of virtue. The poetry that you write and receive is not incidental to your inner life, but central to it. The waka tradition, the haiku tradition, these are not merely literary forms, but modes of perception, ways of paying the kind of attention to the world that reveals what the inattentive person misses. The cherry blossoms that are the subject of so much Japanese poetry are not simply pretty flowers. They are a teaching about impermanence, about the specific beauty of things that are already ending, about the appropriate response to loss and change. When you write a poem about the cherry blossoms falling, you are practicing a form of emotional and philosophical work that the poem both expresses and enables. The Buddhist practice that underpins your spiritual life is another dimension of this inner work. The household butsudan, the temple visits, the sutras recited for the ancestors and for the dead children, these are not merely superstition or custom, but a genuine relationship with the Buddhist understanding of impermanence, suffering, and the path through suffering that has been developed over centuries. The samurai world is, in many ways, built on Buddhist concepts, even as it operates through Confucian social structures, and the women of the samurai class absorb both traditions in ways that shape how they experience and respond to the events of their lives. The inner life of the samurai wife is, in summary, richer than the silence of the historical record might suggest. She does not write in the same volumes or with the same public visibility as her husband. She does not produce the texts of philosophy and strategy that his world requires him to produce. But the diaries and letters that survive, the pillow books tradition of women's writing, the poems exchanged within networks of educated women, the occasional memoir or account that has made it through the centuries, these reveal an inner life of genuine depth and complexity, shaped by the same aesthetic and philosophical traditions that shaped the external world, turned inward toward a self that was private and cultivated and not always fully legible to the outside eye. The samurai wife's life moves through seasons that are larger than the annual cycle of the garden, seasons of social position and domestic power and physical capacity that define the arc of a life in this world. The earliest years of marriage are years of learning and subordination. You are new to the household. Your mother in law knows how things are done, and learning her way of doing them, which may differ in significant respects from your birth family's customs, is the primary task. The relationship with the mother in law is one of the most discussed in the literature of the era because it is one of the most consequential. A kind and reasonable mother in law can make the transition into the new household a genuine education. A harsh or jealous one can make the same years a prolonged ordeal. The samurai wife's code requires her to serve the mother in law with respect and patience, regardless of how that service is received, which is a demanding standard in comfortable circumstances and an extraordinary one in difficult ones. The birth of children, particularly sons, marks a transition. You are no longer simply a daughter in law. You are the mother of the household's heirs, and this elevates your position within the household's internal hierarchy in ways that are subtle but real. Your relationship with your husband develops in these years. The formal partnership of the early marriage deepens through shared anxieties about sick children and shared satisfactions in their accomplishments into something more textured. You know each other in the way that people who have managed difficult things together come to know each other. The middle years, when your children are growing and your household management skills are at their peak, are in many ways the years of fullest authority. You know the household completely. The servants have learned your standards and your manner. Your social position among the samurai women of your community is established. The network of relationships with the wives of your husband's colleagues and superiors, with your own birth family through continued correspondence and visits with the female community of the temple, is developed and maintained through careful attention. These are the years when the education and training of your early life bear their fullest fruit. The tea ceremony that you host for significant occasions in these middle years is an opportunity to demonstrate a maturity of practice that the early years could not have produced. The guests who come to your tea room are doing so in part for the tea, and in part because your hosting of the tea ceremony is itself a statement about the household's cultivation and standing. The aesthetic choices you make in arranging the room, selecting the utensils, choosing the sweets that accompany the tea, these are read by knowledgeable guests as a form of autobiography. The seasons of the year are marked in your life through the specific forms that the Japanese aesthetic calendar prescribes. Spring begins with the plum blossoms before the cherry blossoms that get more attention, and you note their arrival with a poem or an arrangement. The cherry blossoms themselves, hanami, the viewing of the blossoms, is one of the genuine pleasures of the year, a time when the aesthetic experience of beauty and impermanence is shared across the social classes, when the blossoms falling in the wind are simultaneously beautiful and a teaching about everything that ends. You compose, you observe. The composing and the observing are the same act. Summer brings the heat, which in the traditional Japanese house means opening all the screens and living in something closer to outdoor than indoor space, the garden and the house continuous, in a way that the winter's closed screens do not permit. The summer clothing is different. Lighter silks, patterns associated with water and coolness, the aesthetic choices of the wardrobe aligned with the season's needs and the season's symbolic vocabulary. You manage the household through the heat with adaptations that the seasonal wisdom of this culture has developed over centuries. Autumn is the season most associated with melancholy in Japanese aesthetics. Mononoa wear is at its most palpable in autumn, when the maples turn and the chrysanthemums bloom, and the year begins visibly to be ending. The chrysanthemum is the imperial flower, and the chrysanthemum festival in the ninth month is a formal occasion. The quality of autumn light is different, more golden and more angled, and the shadows it casts in the garden are worth composing. Autumn is a season for looking back as much as forward, for inventory and assessment, and the particular beauty of things in the process of completing themselves. Winter, when the screens are closed and the household turns inward, has its own pleasures. The brazier provides warmth. The household gathers closer. The sounds of the outside world are more distant. There is time, in the long winter evenings, for the kinds of cultural pursuits that the busier seasons crowd out: extended poetry composition, music, the deep reading that the shorter days require. There is also time for the kind of quiet conversation between husband and wife in the privacy of their rooms on a winter night that is the texture of intimacy in this world. Not declarations, but the accumulation of shared observation, the kind of knowing that comes from years of proximity to another person's way of being in the world. The later years bring a different form of authority. If your mother in law has died, you are now the senior woman of the household, and the daughter in law who arrives for your son is the young woman you once were, learning the household's ways under your observation. How you manage this reversal, whether you are the kind of mother in law whose authority is wielded with generosity or with the accumulated resentments of your own early years, is a test of character that your code has been preparing you for all your life. The later years also bring the approach of your own death, and the Buddhist framework that has been present in your life from the beginning provides the conceptual vocabulary for this approach. Impermanence is the first teaching. The self is not fixed and permanent, but flowing and temporary, and the release of it is not a loss, but a return. The composure that has been required of you at every stage of your life is required at this stage too, and the practice of a lifetime has ideally prepared you for it. What you leave behind is not, in most cases, a written legacy. The samurai wife's contributions to the world are largely invisible in the historical record, not because they were small, but because they operated in the sphere that the record does not capture well. The household she managed, the children she raised, the community she helped maintain, the aesthetic choices she made that shaped the lives of everyone in her world. These are real contributions to the culture of one of the most refined civilizations in human history. They simply do not leave the kind of trace that texts and buildings and paintings leave. They leave instead the thing that all genuine care leaves, an influence that continues in the people and the places it shaped long after the person who did the shaping is gone. The Edo period is defined, in large part, by peace. The Tokugawa shogunate's consolidation of power in the early 17th century brought an end to the era of warring states, the Sengoku period, and the 2.5 centuries that follow are, by historical standards, remarkably free of the widespread military conflict that had characterized Japanese history before them. But peace is not safety, and the peace of the Edo period does not mean that the samurai woman's martial training is irrelevant. It means that the contexts in which it might be needed are different. The naginata that has been part of your education since childhood is stored in your room with the same care that your husband's swords receive. It is maintained, the blade kept sharp, the shaft checked regularly for damage. This maintenance is not ceremonial. It is the maintenance of a functional weapon by someone who knows how to use it. The fact that you hope never to need it does not change the reality of what it is. The scenarios in which you might need it are ones that the Edo period's official peace does not eliminate. Ronin, masterless samurai who have lost their lords through death or dismissal, were a persistent feature of Edo society, and they ranged from genuinely honorable men navigating difficult circumstances to desperate individuals capable of violence. A household attacked in the husband's absence, a threat that arises from the specific vulnerabilities of a samurai family, the grudges of enemies, the possibilities of political conflict filtering down to the family level. These are not hypothetical concerns. The historical record preserves accounts of samurai women who defended their households in exactly these circumstances. Women who fought off attackers, who protected children, who bought time for escape or for the arrival of help, who died in defense of what they were obligated to protect. These accounts are not myths or legends. They are the documented consequences of taking seriously an education in a skill that was meant to be used if necessary. The kaiken in your robes is the more personal dimension of this readiness. The circumstances in which it might be used against yourself rather than against a threat are the circumstances of extreme dishonor or capture, situations that the Edo period's relative stability makes less common but does not eliminate. Women who were captured by enemies in earlier eras and who used the kaiken to prevent the dishonor of capture have their stories in the samurai literature, told not with horror but with admiration. The act is understood as the ultimate expression of the code, the proof that honor matters more than survival. The seppuku, ritual suicide, that is associated with samurai culture is primarily a male practice, the means by which a samurai takes his own life in circumstances of dishonor or defeat. The female equivalent is jigai, the self administered cut to the jugular vein with the kaiken, and the historical record suggests that samurai women prepared for this possibility with the same deliberateness that their husbands prepared for seppuku. Before jigai, a woman would bind her knees together with cord to ensure that her body would be found in a dignified posture. This preparation, this concern for propriety in death, is the samurai code carried to its ultimate expression. The psychological dimension of living with this possibility, the constant awareness that the code might demand the ultimate price, is one that is difficult to fully inhabit from a modern perspective. We live in a world where the highest virtue is survival, where the body's continuation is the starting premise of every ethical calculation. The samurai world operates from different premises, and the samurai wife absorbs those premises as completely as her husband does. What this does to the texture of daily life is harder to specify. It creates, perhaps, a particular quality of attention to the present, an awareness that each season may be the last, each meal the last, each poem the last, that gives the practice of mano no aware its experiential bite. If impermanence is the first teaching, and you believe that teaching in your body as well as your mind, then the cherry blossoms are really falling. The awareness is not morbid. It is, in the Buddhist framework, liberating, a release from the illusion of permanence that allows a fuller inhabitation of what is actually here. The Edo period also brings specific dangers that are less dramatic but more constant. The political dangers of a society organized around rigid hierarchy and enforced by a surveillance apparatus that was, by the standards of the era, remarkably effective. The Tokugawa shogunate maintained control through a system of mutual surveillance, the guningumi, groups of 5 households who were collectively responsible for each other's behavior, that made individual transgression very difficult to conceal. Political dissent, religious nonconformity, social infractions of the rules that governed every aspect of life, from the clothes you wore to the food you ate, to the manner in which you addressed people of different rank. These were policed by a system that did not distinguish between the domestic sphere and the public one. The samurai wife's conduct, therefore, is political in a direct sense. Her management of the household, her social behavior, her adherence to the codes of dress and demeanor appropriate to her station, these are not merely personal matters, but contributions to, or detractors from, the household's relationship with the political structure that governs everyone's lives. Getting these things wrong in visible ways has consequences that extend beyond her own discomfort. And so she attends, she is careful, she maintains. This is not paranoia, but competence, the competence of someone who understands the world she lives in and navigates it with the skill that understanding provides. The specific nature of Ronin, the masterless samurai, as a social phenomenon in the Edo period, illuminates something about the world the samurai wife inhabits. Ronin were samurai whose lords had died or who had been dismissed from service, men trained to a specific purpose who found themselves without a sanctioned outlet for their training, drifting at the margins of a society organized around the lord-retainer relationship. The most famous Ronin in Japanese history are the 47 Ronin, the men who waited years and then avenged their master's death in 1703 in a story that became one of the defining narratives of the samurai code. But ordinary Ronin, less dramatically situated, navigating poverty and purposelessness without the redemptive arc, were a common and sometimes dangerous feature of the landscape. The samurai wife's awareness of the Ronin's existence is part of her general awareness of the world's dangers, the background against which her naginata training makes practical sense. A household protected by a resident samurai husband is a different proposition from a household temporarily without one, and the skills you have spent years developing are specifically calibrated for exactly that difference. The Metsuke, the inspectors who served as the Tokugawa shogunate's surveillance and enforcement apparatus, are another presence in the world that shapes the samurai wife's conduct. The Metsuke reported to the senior leadership on the behavior of daimyo and their retainers, monitoring for signs of disloyalty, inappropriate ambition, or behavior that violated the shogunate's extensive regulations. This monitoring extended indirectly to the domestic sphere. A household whose conduct was conspicuous in the wrong ways attracted attention, and the samurai wife's management of the household's propriety was part of the family's political safety. The restrictions on travel in the Edo period, the system of checkpoints on the major roads, the requirement to carry papers authorizing travel, the specific rules governing who could travel and under what circumstances, shape the samurai wife's world in ways that are less obvious than the martial dangers, but equally real. Travel without authorization was not merely illegal, but deeply suspicious, and the movement of women through checkpoints was subject to particularly careful scrutiny because unauthorized travel by women was associated with flight from households, the escape of wives from intolerable marriages that the kakekomidera system was a sanctioned alternative to. The checkpoints are not personal threats to a samurai wife in good standing, living an appropriate life, but their existence shapes the texture of her world, makes certain freedoms unavailable as possibilities, even if they were never likely to be exercised. The road out of her domain is supervised. The world beyond her household's social network requires authorization to enter. This is the structure of the controlled society she inhabits, and her navigation of it, with full knowledge of its rules, maintaining the propriety that keeps the family within the permitted sphere, is another form of the competence that defines her life. The practical expression of this code in daily peacetime life is sometimes misread as purely symbolic, a vestige of an earlier era maintained as tradition. This misreads the Edo period's actual conditions. The peace of the Tokugawa era was real, but imperfect, and the domestic sphere remained a space where real threats could appear and where the woman's preparation to respond was genuinely functional. The maintenance of the naginata and continued practice of its techniques was not nostalgia. It was prudence, the same prudence that keeps a fire bucket filled in a house that has never yet caught fire. The samurai wife who trains every week in the confined space techniques of naginata defense is not performing history. She is doing what competent people in uncertain worlds have always done, preparing with full seriousness for a possibility she sincerely hopes will arrive. Arrive. The silence of the historical record around women's lives is not complete. There are women who wrote, and what they wrote has survived, and it is in their writing that the samurai wife's inner life becomes most fully visible. The tradition of women's writing in Japan is older than the samurai class itself. The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon and The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, both written by court women in the Heian period, roughly a century before the rise of the samurai class, are among the greatest works in Japanese literature, and their existence demonstrates that the culture of women's writing was established and valued long before the Edo period that concerns us tonight. The samurai wife who wrote did so in a tradition with deep roots and genuine prestige. The diaries and letters of samurai women in the Edo period reveal, as all personal writing reveals, a life considerably more textured than the official version. They record the ordinary and the extraordinary with equal care. The management of a difficult servant, the beauty of the plum blossoms in an unusually cold spring, the anxiety about a child's fever, the grief of a loss recorded with the compressed precision that the poetry tradition demands, the pride in a son's accomplishment, the ambivalent feelings about a daughter's marriage into a household far from home. The women who wrote were doing something that their culture simultaneously valued and constrained. Writing was a cultivated skill, a mark of education and refinement, evidence of the cultural attainment that the samurai wife was expected to demonstrate. But writing that ventured too far into criticism of the social order, or that expressed feelings inconsistent with the composure the code required, was a different matter. The self presentation in these documents is shaped by awareness of audience. Even a private diary in this world is not entirely private. Not in a household where the domestic sphere is observed by servants and managed for the household's honor. And yet the genuine feelings come through. The loneliness of a wife whose husband is away for an extended period, expressed not through complaint, but through the observation of small details that register more acutely in his absence, the sound of rain on the garden, the particular quality of light in the room where they usually sit together, the fear during an illness that is more intense than it can easily be expressed, the love for a child that exceeds what the official vocabulary of duty quite accommodates. There are women in the historical record whose lives, for various reasons, give us more detail than the general samurai wives. Lady Nijo, whose memoir Towazugatari survives from the medieval period, describes the life of a court woman with a candor that was apparently so uncomfortable for later generations that the text was suppressed for centuries before being rediscovered. The specificity of her account, her loves, her losses, her negotiation of a world that demanded her service while rarely protecting her interests, gives us a window into women's inner lives that the more careful documents do not fully open. The poet Chione, who became a Buddhist nun in the 18th century and whose haiku are among the finest in the tradition, was not a samurai wife, but was educated in the same aesthetic tradition and shared its values. Her most famous poem, the one about the morning glory vine that has wrapped itself around her well bucket, is a poem about a specific moment of domestic awareness. The choice to go elsewhere for water rather than disturb the vine, the awareness of beauty as something worth protecting at the cost of inconvenience, that speaks directly to the aesthetic sensibility that the samurai wife's education cultivated. The exchange of poetry between women, verses sent with gifts, with seasonal greetings, with condolences and congratulations, and the casual observations of daily life, maintained a network of female connection that was one of the samurai wife's primary social resources. The male world of the samurai is organized around the lord retainer relationship, the bonds forged in service and battle and shared obligation. The female world is organized differently, around a network of relationships maintained through correspondence and visits, and the exchange of the aesthetic currency that their shared education provides. The women's network is not simply domestic, it is a genuine information system, a way of knowing what is happening in the social world that is complementary to the information systems of the male sphere. A wife whose husband is absent, navigating a complex situation with his lord, receives intelligence about the situation through her own network. The wife of another retainer, the sister married into a household connected to the lord's, that informs her management of the household's response. This is not gossip, it is practical intelligence gathered through relationships maintained over years. The women who wrote, who maintained their networks, who practiced their arts and managed their households and raised their children and observed their worlds with the careful attention that the tea ceremony teaches, these women are the samurai wife in her fullest form, not the simplified figure of the mythology, silent and decorative. The actual person, complex and capable, and shaped by a world that was itself complex, who found ways to live fully within the constraints of her position, because the position, for all its constraints, was also genuinely rich. Her writing is the proof, her survival is the evidence. The fact that we can read her words across centuries and across an enormous distance of cultural difference and find in them something recognizable, the grief, the love, the aesthetic pleasure, the management of difficulty with more grace than it deserves, is the demonstration that the samurai wife was, whatever else she was, fully human in exactly the ways that fully human people always are. The specific women whose writing survives from the samurai and related worlds of feudal Japan deserve individual mention because they are not abstractions, but people who left records of specific lives. Lady Nijo, whose memoir has already been mentioned, describes the life of a court woman of the Kamakura period with an unsettling frankness about the sexual and political vulnerabilities of her position. She was not a samurai wife, but a court lady in service to the retired emperor, and her world is aristocratic rather than military. But the values of the educated woman of this era, the poetry, the aesthetic sensibility, the management of loss and change with cultivated composure, are shared across the court and the military aristocracy, and her account illuminates the inner life of women in this broader world with a specificity that more restrained writers don't provide. The poet Yosano Akiko, writing in the early 20th century, at the very end of the era we have been discussing, represents the samurai descended world in transition. Her poetry breaks from the classical forms in ways that her predecessors could not have, expressing desire and independence with a directness that the earlier vocabulary of restrained indirection could not accommodate. She is the samurai woman's education applied to a different social situation, the aesthetic and intellectual cultivation of centuries pointing in a new direction. Her existence is only possible because of the long tradition of women's education in Japan that preceded her. The centuries of mothers teaching daughters to write and compose and think. The contemporary practice of naginata, which continues in Japan today as a martial art and is practiced primarily by women, is a direct inheritance from the tradition we have been discussing. Women who practice naginata today are participating in a lineage that connects them to the samurai wives who trained with the same weapon for the same reasons, and the practice maintains something of the original understanding that competence in the management of danger is a legitimate and valuable thing for women to possess. The tea ceremony, similarly, continues as a practice that carries within it the entire aesthetic philosophy we have been discussing. Schools of tea that trace their lineage directly to Sen no Rikyu's teaching still operate in Japan, and the women who practice the ceremony today are participating in the same discipline of attention and impermanence and the cultivation of the present moment that the samurai wife practiced in the same form, with the same bowls and the same movements centuries before them. The garden aesthetic, the poetry tradition, the practices of Buddhist observance, the training in calligraphy that produces a specific quality of attention to the movement of ink on paper. These are all continuations of the samurai wife's world into the present, evidence that what she valued and cultivated has outlasted the social structure that produced it. She was not merely a historical figure occupying a particular social niche. She was a practitioner of arts and disciplines that turned out to have lasting value, and the fact that they endure in recognizable form is a kind of testament to the depth of what she practiced. The day is ending. The house has settled into its evening quiet. Supper has been cleared, the lacquerware cleaned and put away with the care its surfaces require. The servants have completed their evening tasks and withdrawn to their quarters. The children, if they are young enough, have been settled for sleep, the futon laid out, the mosquito net arranged in summer, the extra covering provided in winter, the brief prayers said at the butsudan before the lamp is lowered. If they are older, they have retreated to their own studies or their own sleep. Your husband, if he is home, sits in the room that is both his and yours, reading or writing or simply being in the quiet that the end of a long day of service permits. You join him. The conversation, when it comes, is not the conversation that outsiders might imagine, not reporting or accounting, not the processing of events in the manner that modern couples process their days. It is slower than that, less verbal, more a matter of shared presence in the same space, the occasional observation that does not require a response, the awareness of the other person's nearness that has its own form of intimacy. Or he is not home. He is in Edo, or at the castle, or somewhere on the business of his lord that takes him away from you for weeks or months at a time. In his absence, the evening has a different quality, not worse necessarily, but different. The house is more entirely yours. The silence is more complete. You sit with your writing, or your sewing, or the poetry that is forming itself in the back of your mind from the observations of the day, and the quiet is a thing you have learned to inhabit rather than resist. The lamp burns low. The garden beyond the shoji is dark, but you know its shapes by memory. The stone lantern, the maple that will be crimson in another month, the mossy stepping stones that lead from the Engawa, the veranda, to the central stone. The sound of the water feature is constant and soft, as reliable as breathing, as familiar as your own heartbeat. You think about the day's management, what was accomplished, what remains for tomorrow, whether the household is in order, whether there is anything that needs attention before morning. This assessment is not anxiety, but competence, the same competence that runs through every aspect of your life, the ongoing management of a complex enterprise that runs because you run it, that maintains its quality because you maintain yours. You think about your children sleeping somewhere in the house, breathing the same household air, dreaming whatever children dream. You think about your husband, wherever he is, in the castle town or in Edo, or somewhere on a road between. You hold them in the same quiet space where the evening's poetry has been forming, and the holding is a form of prayer, or close enough to prayer that the distinction doesn't matter. You light incense at the butsudan, the thin column of smoke rising in the still air of the room, the smell of sandalwood marking the space between the living household and the ancestors who are also in this understanding present. You recite the sutra you have recited every evening of your adult life, the words worn smooth by repetition into something that the mouth knows independently of the mind, that continues even when the mind is somewhere else. This is not empty ritual. This is the maintenance of a relationship. This is the thread that connects you to the dead, and through them to the living, and through the living to whatever comes after all of this. The lamp is lower now. The garden is fully dark. The house is breathing. You unpin your hair. The elaborate arrangement of the daytime is let down. There is a specific quality of release in this that is not entirely physical, the putting down of the day's performance, the return to the self that the performance surrounds and supports and is not quite identical to. The woman who manages the household and hosts the tea ceremony and composes the poem and maintains the composure is also this woman in the evening quiet, with her hair down and the lamp burning low, who has always been here inside all of that. Your husband's absence or presence shapes the evening but does not determine it. You have a self that the marriage does not exhaust, an inner life that the code cannot fully script, a particular way of being in the world that is yours and has been yours since before you could name it. You fold the futon from its storage. You arrange the sleeping place. You lie down on the tatami and pull the covering over you and let the day release its hold, bit by bit, the way the cherry blossoms release the branch, not all at once, not without a kind of grace. The house makes its night sounds. The garden speaks in water and wind. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of the city settling into itself, into its own darkness, its own rest. You are a samurai wife. You carry everything the title means, the obligations, the skills, the code, the beauty, the danger, the constrained and genuine life. You carry it with the composure that has been your inheritance and your practice, and on the best days, something that feels close to peace. The lamp goes out. Sleep comes. Tomorrow the house will need you again, and you will be there. But not yet. Not yet. For now, just this. Just the dark and the quiet and the sound of water in the garden. Just rest. Thank you for spending this evening in Japan with me. If you made it all the way through, or if you drifted off somewhere around the tea ceremony and just woke up, you've done exactly what you came here to do. If drowsy history has become part of how you wind down, the best thing you can do is subscribe. It helps more of these long, slow stories find the people who need them. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if there's a corner of history you'd like to visit next, I'd love to hear it. I read everyone. Until the next quiet evening, rest well, breathe slowly, and let sleep come in its own time. Good night.